How's what you on my 3,000 follower Instagram feed? Mostly locals.
Hi everyone, I work for Costco and I'm asking this member to put on a mask because that is our company policy. So either wear the mask
And I'm not doing it because I woke up in a free country.
A lot of Americans have been freaking out about the coronavirus shutdown mitigation rules, and while most states have relaxed the quarantine policy, there are still rules that people have to comply with. They are procedures that businesses have to comply with and they have to conform to, like, wearing a mask, making sure that people are 6 feet apart and all that stuff. So quarantine rules haven't totally been relaxed. We are still living under mitigation policy. And so you have all of these Americans who are complaining and they're talking about how they're living under tyranny and despotism and, oh, this is so despotic and so evil because communism. And of course, you have this video that came out recently. It went viral, I think, on Twitter, and it's some guy who looks like he has a serious addiction to KFC or maybe those fried chicken sandwiches at Popeyes. And he's going off about how he doesn't want to wear a mask in Costco. And you have a very, very polite, very nice employee at Costco who says, please wear a mask. And he says, I woke up in the morning and I thought I was living in a free country. And so you have all of these doofuses living like they are freedom fighters fighting against the Soviet Union or something like that, which is very ironic because you have so many conservatives complaining about tyranny when it's their guy who's in office and it's their guy who was supposed to purge the swamp and liberate us from the evil tyranny that the African dictator Obama was imposing on poor Americans. So it really is quite hilarious and ironic that conservatives are complaining now more than ever about living in tyranny when their guy, their savior Trump, is the one who's in office. I find that to be pretty funny. But people are complaining about, mitigation rules and wearing a mask and all that. And they're using terms like unprecedented to describe the situation when this whole situation is anything but unprecedented, because guess what? Our great-grandparents went through pretty much the same exact thing during the 1918 influenza pandemic. 50 million people worldwide were killed by the Spanish flu. They were killed by the influenza. 50 million people worldwide, hundreds of thousands of Americans died of influenza in 1918. Why did so many Americans die? Well, because they didn't want to follow the rules. Because in those days, the U.S. government pushed the same, imposed, the U.S. government made mandatory the same rules that we have been seeing in the corona crisis. Stay home. Businesses have to be closed. Certain businesses have to be closed. Churches, places of worship need to be closed down. Bowling alleys, sporting events, they all have to be canceled because we are in the middle of a pandemic, a very, very dangerous pandemic. And they were a bunch of people, just like today, in 1918, who didn't want to follow the rules. They didn't want to follow safety procedures. And so they died. Just like today, you have people who refuse to wear a seatbelt. They don't want to wear a seatbelt, and they get into an accident, and they end up dead. Or a child ends up dead because the child wasn't wearing a freaking seatbelt. And so we're sitting here saying, oh, it's unprecedented. And we're making a huge deal about this, and people are freaking out, and people are I was reading this article about how police officers have been called, for the most part, to settle in-house disputes, and how in-house arguments and violence has increased by 200% because of coronavirus shutdown mitigation rules. It was something like that. It was a very, very high number. I'm not sure if it was 200%, but it was a very, very high number. And it's like, why are people freaking out over this? Why are people so insane? Why are they so hysterical? Our great-grandparents went through far worse things than this. Far worse things than this. The generation of our great-grandparents, not our grandparents, unless you have a grandma that's like 100 years old, but for the most part, our great-grandparents, that generation went through absolute hell on earth. It was like the Spanish flu, tens of millions dead. Then you had World War I. Utter abysmal, horrifying experiences. People killing each other in trenches, people killing each other with poisonous gas, disease spreading among soldiers, and you had to murder your fellow man in the midst of all this, and if you didn't, there was someone right behind you who would shoot you in the back. And that's how it was. People were very, very ruthless in those days. Extremely ruthless. Look at a guy like Winston Churchill. You know, we all sit here and worship Winston Churchill. And we're like, oh, poor Churchill, poor Churchill. So many British people hated him. And, you know, the Nazis were taking power and he was running for office and people hated him and he lost and he had to run again. Oh, poor Winston Churchill. There was a reason why so many British people hated Winston Churchill. And the reason was because he sent a bunch of young men to their freaking deaths during the First World War. I'm talking specifically of the Battle of the Dardanelles. Battle of the Dardanelles. Dardanelles is a peninsula that is in Turkey, and the British and the French, they wanted to get through that peninsula and take it over and take it from the Turks because it was a very, very strategic location. And so the British sent a bunch of, not English people, not British people, the British sent a bunch of Australians and New Zealanders. The New Zealanders were called Anzacs, and they were part of a battalion called the Anzac Battalion. And there's a reason why people in Australia and New Zealand remember the Battle of the Dardanelles every single year, and why British people rarely ever talk about what happened in the Dardanelles. Because it was the Aussies and the New Zealanders who suffered more than the British in that battle. And they sent a bunch of British ships with a bunch of Aussies and New Zealanders in them into the Dardanelles, into that peninsula. And Churchill was told that that waterway, that maritime territory, is riddled with mine bombs and German U-boats. The Germans were supporting the Ottoman Empire. They were allies. And Churchill said, it doesn't matter, send them to their deaths anyway. It doesn't matter how many soldiers die, we are still going to get the support of the people. He said something to the likes of that. He didn't give a damn about human life. And so all these ships were sent through the Dardanelles, and what Churchill was warned about was exactly what took place. What was predicted is what occurred. And a bunch of ships were destroyed by underwater mines, because they went right into a minefield, and a bunch of ships were hit by U-boats, German U-boats. And they sent all these soldiers into the beaches of the Dardanelles, and it was like Normandy Beach. It was like D-Day. Aussies and New Zealanders will tell Americans, hey, you know, you guys talk about D-Day and Normandy Beach a lot. Here's what you don't understand. We, the Aussies, this is what they say, we, the Aussies and the Anzacs, we went through something like Normandy Beach before you guys went through D-Day. We experienced that type of fighting before you guys did. Aussies and New Zealanders will say things like this because they did. And they got on those beaches, and this is what happened. They told these Anzacs and these Aussies, we're going to put you on these little boats, and we're going to get you right onto the beaches. And waiting for you is a bunch of Turkish soldiers with the Gatling guns. Boom, 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 boom. They sent the boats with a bunch of soldiers, young guys, and they landed on the beaches, the doors opened up, and exactly what they thought took place. Their worst nightmare. They had to run through a storm of Turkish gunfire, and then they had to get hit by German cannons. The problem is, you had hundreds of thousands of Australian and Anzac troops on the Dardanelles, and their ships, their naval ships, were destroyed. They were destroyed either by U-boats, they were destroyed by underwater mines. So now they had literally zero naval support. They were completely isolated and left to the mercy of Turkish cannons and gunfire. And those Turkish cannons were made by German engineering. People don't talk about the German contribution to what the Ottoman Empire did, be it in the Armenian genocide or be it in fighting against the British. The Germans were really the only reason why the Ottomans had efficient military technology. For the most part, it was German ingenuity. the Turkish ships, the Turkish railway system, the cannons. A lot of this stuff came from German engineering. Kind of like how the Turks invaded Constantinople with a giant cannon, the biggest cannon in the world at that time, engineered by Germans and Hungarians. So here you had hundreds of thousands of Anzacs and Australian troops stuck in this peninsula, surrounded by cannons and Turkish snipers and Turkish guns, and they have no naval support. And they were stuck there for months. I want to say it was 2 or 3 months that battle lasted. Hundreds of thousands of Anzacs and Australian troops either dead or wounded, and they were eventually forced to surrender. And when they surrendered, the nightmare didn't end. They were forced by Turkish soldiers to travel through the Middle East, travel through the desert, and many of them starved to death. Many of them died from dehydration. The ones who made it were forced into a labor camp where they had to labor right alongside Armenian laborers, right alongside Armenian slaves. And the British saw the Armenian genocide. They witnessed the Armenian genocide. And these Australian and New Zealander soldiers, they had to participate in the suffering of the Armenian people. And if you ever read about the Armenian genocide, it is complete horror. A couple of years ago, I read a book. It was called The Fall of the Ottoman Empire. It was written by an historian named Eugene Rogan. And Eugene Rogan has a whole chapter dedicated to the Armenian genocide. There were times where I had to literally put the book down because the level of violence that was being described in this book, the level of human suffering that was being detailed, was extremely overwhelming. It was a horror. I don't even want to say it was a horror movie because movies are fake, but it's like watching the most horrifying thing ever. It's unfathomable, the level of cruelty that took place in this genocide. And that was the generation that our great-grandparents, that was the horror that our great-grandparents went through. And here's the thing is, you know, our great-grandparents went through World War I, World War II. Grandparents went through World War II. After World War II, you come to the 1950s. And the world, the United States specifically, became very Christian and very conservative. But in our great-grandparents' generation, there was a huge amount of occultism that took place. A lot of people were involved in the occult. My great-grandfather's mother was a member of the Christian Science cult. My great-grandfather, Frederick Georgeson, he was a high-ranking member of the Masonic Lodge. Occultism was something very popular. Many people were involved in the Masonic Lodge. Many people were involved in the Theosophical Society. There was a lot of occultism that took place in those days. A lot of witchcraft that took place. And it was very common. Occultism was very ubiquitous. In the post-World War II era, a lot of that stuff died down. Something began to happen in the 1990s where things like Satanism became trendy and you had heavy metal. And now occultism is back into being something very, very common. Wicca and earth worship and paganism, these things are they're very, very popular. In fact, Wicca is one of the largest religions in the world right now. Neo-paganism is one of the largest religions in the world right now. So we are actually returning back to the ruthless disposition of our great-grandparents. We are returning back to that. I remember sitting down with my great-grandmother back in the 1990s. Her name was Dorothy, and she told me, you know, back in the day, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people were extremely cruel in those days. I remember her telling me this, and she was absolutely right. People were absolutely ruthless in those times. But what was very common in those days was occultism. And what is becoming extremely common now is neo-paganism and occultism, which means we are actually returning back. We are returning back to the cruelty of our great-grandparents. In fact, we are going to be tremendously worse than our great-grandparents. Because today, people are weirder, people are sicker, people have much more satanic interests. And you can see this just by reading what people say online. You can read the comment section on a lot of videos on YouTube. Watch any video pertaining to the Holocaust and just read the comments. You have all sorts of vicious racism against Jews. You have very intense anti-Semitism. You have a tremendous amount of Holocaust denial that take place. I remember when I confronted a pederast priest. His name was Monsignor Michael Yarborough. I confronted him in San Antonio, Texas. And I got it on film because I wanted to motivate people to confront these predators. And I got, I want to say, when the video got around 12,000 views, the comments were very, very vicious. And these comments were coming from so-called Catholics. And I was told by one Catholic person that Father Yarborough has done more for humanity than you ever will in your entire life. You should throw yourself off of a window. Then I got another comment from another so-called Catholic saying something like, Father Yarborough is such a great man. You will never be the man that Father Yarborough is. You should kill yourself. And then I got another comment from another so-called Catholic saying, if I were in that church, I would have beaten you up and thrown you out of the church. These people are defending a pederast. They are defending a predator. And they are going against someone who is trying to expose and combat these evil predators in our midst, who are preying on our children, preying on teenage boys. And it makes you wonder as to why there is so much pedophilia and pederastry in the United States. It's because we, as a society, have decided to have zero will to fight against these people. But what does this reflect? What does this denote? What it denotes is how sinister and how satanic of a society we have become, which means that when the next world war happens and when the next series of genocides happen in the Western world and also in Asia, it's going to be far more bloodier and far more vicious than anything we saw in the first half of the 20th century. And we saw some horrific things in that era. We saw the massacre of 60,000 Poles in the massacre of Volhynia, in which Ukrainians butchered tens of thousands of people simply because they were Polish. The Ottoman Empire butchered over 1 million Armenians. The Germans supported the Armenian genocide, and the Germans built the railroad system that the Turks used to facilitate the massacre of over 1 million Armenians. The Ottomans would take Armenian people and force them into these death marches, kind of like the Bataan Death March. They would force the Armenians to walk through the Deir al-Zur, or the Syrian desert, and then after certain amounts of distance were passed, they would reach a checkpoint, and there were checkpoints in this death march. And the checkpoints consisted of concentration camps. So they would put you in a camp, and it wasn't like they would feed you and allow you to sleep. No, no, no. They would cram you in with thousands of other people. And then they would put you on a train, and they would send you off either to a labor camp or they would kill you. During these marches, during these death marches, those who were slow and weak, those who were straggling, they were killed brutally. And the Germans observed all of this. They observed all of this, and they saw how the Turks were able to systematically murder over 1 million people in a short amount of time using the railway system that the Germans engineered. And this became really the template for the Holocaust. During the Armenian genocide, there was a German military commander who was commissioned to oversee the Armenian genocide. And his name was Hans von Seeckt. And Hans von Seeckt was a huge supporter of the Armenian genocide, and he said that we as Germans must support the Armenian genocide, and we cannot allow anything to hinder our support, be it our emotions when we see people suffering, or be it our Christian morality. Hans von Seeckt said this. And it goes to show you how much anti-Christianity was alive in those days, even though today we sort of romanticize that time of history as a very, very Christian time, when in fact it really wasn't. And the words of Hans von Seeckt really do reflect how satanic people were in those days, and the truly satanic disposition that had controlled the world in that era. And so today we see people talking in similar ways. Christianity is for the weak. We cannot allow compassion to rule over us. We must return to our animalistic ways. We see people like Jack Donovan talking about how killing people who are not a part of your tribe is completely okay as long as it fulfills some sort of objective, and as long as you can get away with that crime. And if you can get away with that crime, and if the killing fulfills some sort of a mission, in the words of Jack Donovan, by all means, press play. And Jack Donovan is a part of some very, very satanic movement called Operation Werewolf, and this movement consists of people involved in weird paramilitary activities, and they are preparing for some sort of a satanic event. You can see this just by looking at their words, looking at their writings, looking at their photos on Instagram, and how they glorify death and glorify murder. And you're seeing this horrific rise in neo-paganism. It really is horrendous. It really is horrendous. But this is the world that we live in. And we are returning to something very satanic and very vicious. And God help us when it happens. But I think that because we have told God to leave us alone so much, I don't think he's going to help us that much. Anyway, hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.